The wind that morning did not care where she would sleep. It came hard off the mountains, cutting across the open field like a blade, lifting snow in long white sheets and hurling it against the old farmhouse door that had just been shut in her face. Winter had not yet fully settled in, but it was close enough to taste. The sky hung low and pale, and the kind of cold that makes a body stiff had already begun to sink into the ground. She stood on the porch for a moment longer than pride would allow, her thin coat pulled tight, a small sack of belongings at her feet, and listened to the latch fall into place on the other side. Thrown out before winter. That was the plain truth of it. Folks in town would talk, of course. They always did. A woman without land, without a husband, without a place at someone's table, was a kind of trouble people preferred not to see. She had worked that farm for 3 years, mended fences, fed livestock, kept the books better than the man who owned it ever could. But when debts came due and blame needed a face, hers was the easiest to choose. She did not cry. Not then. Instead, she lifted her sack, stepped down into the snow, and walked toward the open stretch of land behind the property. It was not hers, not officially, but no one had bothered with that rocky strip in years. The soil was too thin for crops, and the wind too sharp for comfort. It was land people forgot about. By sundown, she would claim it. The first night she slept under the open sky, wrapped in a horse blanket she had taken from the barn when no one was looking. The stars were clear and bright as broken glass. She lay awake listening to coyotes in the distance and the dry rattle of frozen grass. The thought pressed against her ribs. Winter was coming fast. Snow would deepen, rivers would freeze. Wood would grow scarce. A woman alone in the American wilderness did not have room for mistakes. But she had $7. $7 folded tight in the lining of her skirt. It was not much even in those days. Not enough for a room in town, not enough for a wagon ride south. It was barely enough for flour and salt pork to last a week. Yet, as she stared up at the sky, another thought came slow and steady. $7 might not buy comfort, but it might buy lumber scraps. Nails, something strong enough to hold against wind. She had seen soldiers' huts once back when she was younger. Curved roofs, ribbed like the inside of a barrel. Quonset huts, someone had called them, cheap to build, quick to raise. Hard for wind to tear apart because it slid right over the top. She did not know how to build one the proper way, but she knew how to measure. She knew how to bend wood when soaked long enough. And she knew that the mountain wind respected a curve more than a flat wall. By morning, her plan had taken shape. She walked the 2 miles into town with snow biting at her ankles. The hardware store was nearly empty, shelves thin from the season's rush. She counted her money twice before stepping up to the counter. Old boards, warped but still strong. A box of bent nails sold at half price. A small hand saw with a chipped handle. The shopkeeper looked at her with a question in his eyes but did not ask it. $7 changed hands, and she walked out carrying more hope than wood. The land behind the farm rose gently toward a line of pine trees. It was there she chose her spot, where the ground was slightly higher and less likely to flood when the spring thaw came. She marked a wide half-circle in the snow with the heel of her boot. The hut would be small, just big enough for a cot, a stove, and a stack of firewood. She would not waste space on comfort. For 3 days she worked without stopping. She cut young saplings and stripped their bark. She soaked them in the shallow bend of the creek to make them pliable. Her hands split and bled in the cold, but she wrapped them in cloth and kept bending, shaping each rib into an arch. She drove stakes into the frozen ground with a rock when her hammer cracked. She fastened boards across the ribs, leaving only a small opening for a door and a narrow slit she hoped would pass for a window. Snow fell twice during those days, light but steady. Each morning she woke stiff and aching, but the sight of the rising frame pushed her forward. The curved roof began to take shape, low and tight against the wind. She layered scrap tin and tar paper across the top, weighting it down with stones. It was not pretty, it was not proper, but it was hers. At night she lay inside the half-finished hut and listened to the wind test her work. It howled across the field, then slipped up and over the curve with a sound like breath drawn through teeth. The structure shuddered but did not give. She would smile in the dark, her body sore beyond words, and whisper that it would hold. What worried her most was not the roof or the walls. It was the firewood. In winter country, dry firewood is life. Wet wood smokes and sputters, eats time and warmth. Snow seeps into every crack. A careless stack left uncovered turns useless by January. She had seen families freeze because they trusted a tarp too thin or a shed built wrong. If she was going to survive alone, she needed her woodpile dry from the first storm to the last thaw. So she built for that first. Inside the hut, against the back curve, she raised a platform from leftover boards, high enough to keep wood off the ground. She left a narrow gap along the roofline for air to move through, but sealed every lower seam tight with mud and straw. Outside, she built a small covered lean-to against the north side, where snow drifted least. Each log she cut from the pines was split small and stacked with care, bark facing up, ends turned inward. She treated each piece like something precious. By the time the real winter came, the Quonset hut stood firm against the white field like a half-buried barrel. Smoke curled from its short stovepipe, thin and steady. The farmhouse in the distance looked smaller now, less certain. Sometimes she caught sight of figures moving near it, watching her from afar. Whether they pitied her or mocked her, she did not know. It no longer mattered. The first heavy storm struck in early December. The sky turned iron gray and snow fell without pause for 2 full days. Drifts swallowed fence posts. The creek froze hard as stone. Wind pounded the hut, pressing against the curved walls, searching for weakness. Inside, she fed the small stove and listened. The fire caught quick on the dry kindling. The flames rose bright and clean, not a hiss of dampness in them. She opened the door once to test the stack outside. The wood beneath the lean-to was dry to the touch, shielded by the careful angle of the roof. She closed the door and leaned back against the curved wall, warmth settling into her bones. Days passed into weeks. The town struggled. Wagons froze in ruts. Livestock thinned. There were whispers that some families had run out of seasoned wood before Christmas. Smoke from chimneys grew weak and patchy. Yet from the field beyond the farm, her stovepipe burned steady. She rose each morning, brushed snow from the doorway, and split another armful for the day. Every log she reached for was dry, light, and ready. People began to notice. One afternoon, as she carried in a stack of pine, she saw a figure crossing the field toward her hut. A man from town, hat pulled low, boots heavy with snow. He stopped a few yards away, eyeing the curved structure, the neat rows of wood, the thin ribbon of smoke. He asked how she had kept it dry. She did not answer right away. She looked past him toward the farmhouse, its chimney sputtering in the cold. Then she looked back at her hut, at the ribs she had bent with bleeding hands, at the $7 that had bought her a chance instead of a coffin. Finally, she told him it was the curve. The wind could not settle on a curve. It slid off. Snow could not cling long either. It fell away before it could soak through. He nodded slowly, as if trying to measure the worth of her knowledge. That evening, as darkness settled over the field, she sensed something shifting. The world that had cast her out was turning its gaze back toward her. Word would spread that the woman thrown out before winter had built a Quonset hut for $7 and kept her firewood dry all winter long. Some would call it stubbornness, others might call it foolish pride. But a few would see what it truly was. Independence has a way of unsettling those who depend on control. Late that night, long after the wind had died down, she woke to a sound outside her door. Not the howl of weather. Not the scratch of branches. It was heavier than that, measured, careful. She sat up, heart steady but alert, and reached for the iron poker beside the stove. The fire still burned bright, fed by wood that had not failed her once. The hut stood solid around her, warm and dry in a world of ice. The sound came again, closer this time, right against the curved wall. Someone had come to her field in the dead of winter, and they were not there to admire her woodpile. She held her breath and listened. The sound did not come again right away. The stove ticked softly as the iron warmed and cooled. Wind brushed across the curved roof in a low sweep, but that was not what had woken her. This had been heavier, closer. Something or someone had stepped against the outer wall of her Quonset hut and paused there. She tightened her grip on the poker and slid off the cot without letting the floorboards creak. The hut was small enough that 3 careful steps brought her to the door. She did not open it. Instead, she pressed her ear to the wood and listened to the cold breathing on the other side. At first, nothing. Then a faint crunch of snow, a slow, deliberate shift of weight. Whoever stood out there knew she was inside. Her mind moved through possibilities the way it once moved through numbers in the farm ledger. A neighbor short on firewood. A boy sent to see how the woman in the field had managed to keep her woodpile dry, or the man who had closed the farmhouse door and told her she was no longer welcome. Pride and resentment travel easily in winter. She forced her voice steady and called out through the door. She asked who was there. Silence answered. That silence was worse than any threat. Coyotes made noise, drunks made noise. Even thieves cursed when they slipped in snow. This was quiet, patient. After a long minute, the crunching steps moved away from the hut, circling behind it. She heard the faint brush of fabric against wood. The lean-to where she stored her firewood sat along the north wall. If someone meant to take it, that was where they would go. Her jaw tightened. Every log stacked under that covered rack had been cut by her hands. Every split piece of pine was a promise of survival through the harsh winter. If someone carried it off, they would not just be stealing wood. They would be stealing her chance to live through February. She eased the latch open just enough to peer outside. The moon hung pale above the field, casting a weak light over the snow. She saw no one at first. The lean-to stood as she had left it, roof angled just right to send snow sliding away. The woodpile beneath it was dark and still. Then she saw a shape near the pine trees. A man, broad-shouldered, moving slow. He did not run. He did not even hurry. He walked back toward town with the steady pace of someone who had come only to look. She watched until he disappeared into the dark. The door closed softly behind her. She leaned her back against it and let out a long breath she had been holding too tight. This was not a wandering traveler. This was someone who knew the land. Someone who had reason to study her hut in the night. Sleep did not come easy after that. The next morning, frost traced the inside edges of the window slit. She stepped outside and circled the hut, scanning the snow. Tracks lay clear as ink on paper, large boots, worn solace. The pattern was familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. She had seen those tracks near the barn for years. The farmhouse stood quiet in the distance, smoke drifting thin from its chimney. If the man had come from there, he would not admit it. He had pride enough to freeze before he would ask for help. And yet town gossip had a way of slipping through cracks. She had heard that his woodpile had rotted in early autumn when rain soaked through a broken shed roof. He had meant to fix it but never did. By the time frost came, half his stack was useless. Now the woman he cast out was burning clean, dry firewood while his own sputtered. She knelt by her lean-to and checked the stack. Nothing had been taken, not yet. But a few logs near the edge had been touched, shifted just slightly. A test, a measure of how easy it might be. She straightened and brushed snow from her skirt. If he wanted her wood, he would have to face her for it. That afternoon she walked into town again. Not to spend money, she had none left to spare, but to listen. The general store was warm and close with the smell of coffee and damp wool. Men stood near the stove speaking in low tones about the winter storm that had cracked the river ice. She kept her head down and pretended to study a sack of flour while their words drifted over her. Someone mentioned the shortage of seasoned pine. Someone else muttered about green wood smoking up chimneys. A third voice, sharp and bitter, said that some folks had it easier than others, that some had found clever ways to keep their firewood dry while the rest paid the price. She felt their eyes brush her back. She turned, calm and steady, and asked if anyone needed help mending fences come spring. The room went quiet for a beat too long. Then one man shrugged and said, maybe. Another looked away. It was not just envy in that room. It was something heavier. In a small town, when one person survives too well in hard times, it unsettles the balance. Her Quonset hut, built for $7, had become a reminder that hardship did not excuse neglect. As she stepped outside, she nearly collided with a thin boy carrying a bundle of sticks twice his size. His cheeks were red from cold and his boots were patched with twine. He recognized her and stared at her like she was something out of a story. He asked if it was true that her firewood had stayed dry through the big storm. She told him it had. He asked how. She looked at his bundle. Half of it was green wood, cut too fresh to burn clean. She could smell the sap from where she stood. She told him to stack it off the ground and cover it with boards if he had them. Leave space for air. Keep snow from sitting on top. He nodded, trying to fix her words in his mind. Then he said his father's shed roof had caved in. The sentence hung between them. She knew what that meant. Wet wood, cold nights, a mother trying to cook over smoke that choked the room. She felt the pull of it. The urge to invite him to her field, to show him the lean-to, to share a few logs. But she also knew how quickly kindness could turn into expectation. If she gave to one family, others would follow. Her stack, though neat and dry, was not endless. She told the boy she would think on it. That night she split wood longer than she needed to, the steady strike of axe against pine echoing across the field. The rhythm helped her think. She had not built this hut only to guard it like a fortress. She had built it to prove she could stand on her own. Yet standing alone carried a cost. The farmhouse chimney smoked heavier that evening, thick and gray. Wet wood, she could tell by the color. She imagined him feeding log after log into the stove, watching it sputter and hiss. Pride burns hotter than pine, but it gives no warmth. After supper, she walked the perimeter of her land again. The snow near the pine trees had been disturbed since morning. Fresh tracks crossed the old ones, not just one pair this time. 2, maybe 3, they had come back while she was in town. They had circled the hut. They had stopped near the stovepipe. She crouched and studied the prints, one set smaller, lighter, the others heavy. This was no curious visit, this was a meeting. The wind rose as she stood there, pushing against the curved roof of her Quonset hut. It held firm, as it always did. Snow slid down its sides and fell clean to the ground. The lean-to creaked but did not shift. Her firewood remained dry, stacked careful and tight. But wood was not the only thing at stake anymore. By the time she stepped inside, she understood something plain. The mystery was not who had come in the night. It was what they planned next. Would they ask for help and swallow pride? Or would they take what they believed should have been theirs all along? She set the poker back by the stove and added another log to the fire. The flames caught quick and bright. The hut warmed around her, safe for now. Outside, beyond the reach of her small window, figures moved again near the tree line. She did not see them, but she felt their presence the way a body feels a coming storm. Winter was not done testing her, and neither were they. The next morning came sharp and clear, the kind of cold that made the world look honest and cruel at the same time. She stepped out of her Quonset hut before sunrise, boots crunching over the frozen crust. The snow reflected the pale light so bright it stung her eyes. For a moment, everything seemed calm. Too calm. She walked straight to the lean-to. Her firewood was still stacked in careful rows, bark up, ends inward, just the way she had left it. She counted without meaning to, eyes moving over the familiar shapes. Nothing missing, not yet, but a fresh set of tracks cut close to the edge of the stack. Close enough that whoever had stood there could have reached out and taken a log without stepping fully under the roof. They were testing her resolve. She stood there longer than she needed to, scanning the field. The farmhouse chimney smoked again, thick and uneven. A gust of wind pushed the smoke low before it rose. Wet wood always told on itself. She remembered the first winter she had spent in that farmhouse. The shed roof had leaked even then. She had told him it needed fixing before frost. He had waved her off and said there was time. There was always time until there was not. The memory tightened her jaw. Back then she had stacked his firewood for him, lifted each split log and set it high off the dirt. She had shown him how to leave space for air between rows. He had listened halfway and forgotten the rest. Now her own firewood remained dry because she had taken the trouble to build right from the start. Trouble and $7. The hut stood solid behind her, curved roof sending wind sliding away. It was not just a shelter. It was proof that careful work could outlast carelessness. That thought made some folks uneasy. By mid-morning she saw movement along the road that cut through town. A wagon creaked toward the general store, pulled by a tired mule. The man driving it kept his collar turned up high, but she recognized his shape. He did not glance toward her field, yet she felt the weight of his thoughts. Later that afternoon, the thin boy returned. He did not come straight to the hut. He lingered near the pine trees, pretending to gather fallen branches. She let him circle for a while before calling out. When he stepped closer, his eyes flicked to the lean-to as if measuring it the way grown men had. He said his mother had sent him to ask if she might sell a few logs. Sell, not borrow. She appreciated that. She asked how many. He held up 5 fingers. 5 logs could mean 3 nights of steady heat if used right. 5 logs could also mean 5 less for her in February when the wind turned bitter and long. She studied him. His coat was too thin for January. His hands shook slightly, though whether from cold or nerves she could not tell. He said they would pay come spring, after his father took work repairing fences along the river. Payment in the future was a fragile promise. Still, she could not forget the way smoke had poured from their chimney that morning. She told him to wait. Inside the Quonset hut, she stood by her stacked wood and counted again. She had cut more than most would think a single woman could. Long hours in the forest, careful splitting, stacking under the lean-to to keep every piece dry. Her supply would hold if the winter was average, but this winter did not feel average. Storms had come early. The river had frozen thick already. If she gave away wood now and the cold stretched longer than expected, she would be the one knocking on doors. She stepped back outside with 3 logs in her arms. She handed them to the boy and told him that was what she could spare for now. She told him to stack them inside, not by the door. Keep them off the floor. Feed the stove slow, not all at once. He nodded, eyes bright with relief. As he walked away, she felt both lighter and more exposed. Kindness could travel through a town faster than rumor. By evening, others would know she had given wood. That night, the sound returned. Not at the wall this time, at the lean-to, a scrape, a soft thud. Then another. She was on her feet before she fully woke, poker in hand. The fire glowed low but steady. She moved to the door and flung it open without calling out. 2 figures stood bent over the stack. One straight and quick, face shadowed by a hat brim. The other stayed crouched, hand on a log. The wind carried her voice sharp and clear across the snow. She asked what they were doing. The standing man answered that they only meant to borrow, that the town was hurting, that she had more than she needed. Borrow without asking. Her gaze shifted to the crouched figure who finally looked up. It was the man from the farmhouse. He did not look ashamed. He looked tired. There were dark hollows under his eyes, and his beard had grown rough. He said nothing at first, just held her stare as if this were still his land, his right to decide what stood upon it. She told them to step away from the woodpile. The standing man muttered that no one could survive alone out here, that winter would break her before long. Better to share now than lose everything later? She felt anger rise, but beneath it was something else. Fear, not for herself, but for what would happen if the town decided she had become selfish. A woman living alone in a Quonset hut, guarding dry firewood while others froze, could easily turn into a villain in whispered stories. She said she had worked for every log under that roof, that she had warned about the shed in autumn. That winter did not forgive neglect. The farmhouse man finally spoke. He said she thought herself better now, with her curved roof and tidy stack. He said a hut built for $7 did not make her stronger than the rest of them. She answered that it made her prepared. The wind picked up then, tugging at coats and hats. Snow swirled around their boots. For a moment no one moved. Then the standing man dropped the log he had been holding and stepped back. He said they would remember this. They walked away together, leaving the disturbed snow as proof of how close they had come. She did not sleep at all that night. The conflict had shifted. It was no longer about silent footsteps in the dark. It was open now, a question hanging over the field like smoke. Would she guard her independence at all cost, or bend under pressure from the town? Over the next week, small changes spread through daily life. When she went into town, conversations hushed quicker than before. The shopkeeper weighed her flour without meeting her eyes. A group of men near the stove spoke louder than necessary about fairness and community. No one named her directly, but the meaning was clear. At the same time, a different current moved beneath the surface. The boy returned again, not to ask for wood, but to tell her his mother had stacked it the way she said, that the fire had burned cleaner, that for the first time that winter the kitchen had felt warm instead of smoky. He spoke in a low voice as if sharing a secret. He also said that some men had talked of building their own lean-tos the way she had, of trying a curved roof to keep snow from settling. Her method was spreading whether she liked it or not. That brought a different kind of worry. If others began building Quonset huts or raised wood racks like hers, it would not be long before they saw how simple the design truly was. $7 and steady hands. She had no patent on it, no claim beyond the sweat in her palms. Would they respect her for showing the way? Or resent her for making them look foolish first? One evening, as she hauled in another armful of dry pine, she noticed something new near the pine trees. A rough frame had been set up, just visible through branches. Someone was bending saplings, trying to form an arch. They were copying her. The sight filled her with mixed feelings. Pride that the idea had taken root. Fear that it would not hold if built poorly. And a deeper unease that her small act of survival had turned into a quiet challenge against the old ways of doing things. Later, as dusk settled, she saw the farmhouse man standing at the edge of his property, watching the field. He did not cross it this time. He only stood there, hands in pockets, smoke rising weak from his chimney behind him. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her hut. Did he see betrayal? Did he see a mistake he could have avoided? Or did he see the shape of something he no longer controlled? Inside her Quonset hut, the fire burned clean and steady, fed by wood that remained dry despite storm after storm. The lean-to creaked under fresh snow but held firm. Her supplies would last if she rationed carefully. Yet the true test of winter was no longer just cold. It was pressure. It was pride. It was the thin line between standing alone and standing apart. That night, as wind swept low across the field, she heard distant hammering near the pine trees. Someone working late, trying to shape their own curved roof before the next storm. She lay on her cot and stared at the arch above her, tracing the ribs she had bent with aching hands. The hut had been built to keep out wind and snow. It had not been built to keep out resentment. And as the hammering echoed through the dark, she understood that the real storm had only just begun to gather. The hammering near the pine trees did not stop the next day. It carried across the frozen field in short, uneven bursts. Someone was trying to bend saplings the way she had. Someone was trying to copy the curve of her Quonset hut before the next hard storm rolled in. She stepped outside with her axe resting against her shoulder and watched from a distance. Two men struggled to hold a green trunk in place while a third tried to force it into an arch. The wood cracked sharp in the cold air. They were rushing. Winter did not forgive rushing. She felt the pull to walk over and tell them they needed to soak the saplings first. That dry wood in deep cold would split before it bent. But she stayed where she was. Advice offered too soon might be heard as pride. Advice offered too late might be heard as blame. By noon, a rough frame stood crooked among the trees. It did not have the smooth curve her hut carried. It looked strained, like it was holding its breath. The sky that afternoon turned the color of steel. The air grew still in a way that made birds vanish and even the pines fall silent. She had seen that kind of sky before. A blizzard was building beyond the mountains. She checked her lean-to once more. Every row of firewood remained dry. She tightened the boards along the north side and added a strip of scrap tin where snow had drifted deeper than usual. Inside the hut, she packed mud into a small crack near the doorframe and tested the stovepipe for a firm fit. Her $7 shelter had held so far, but this storm would test every seam. By late afternoon, word had spread through town. Wagons moved faster than usual, hauling last-minute supplies. The general store closed early. Smoke rose from chimneys in thicker plumes as families stoked stoves in preparation. She saw the farmhouse man cross his yard twice, carrying armfuls of wood from what remained of his old shed. Even from a distance she could tell much of it was damp. He was burning through what little he had left. As the first snow began to fall, light and steady, the thin boy appeared at the edge of her field again. He did not come all the way to the hut this time. He only raised a hand and pointed toward the rough frame among the pines. His mouth moved, but the wind swallowed his words. She understood anyway. They had not finished. The storm came in full force after nightfall. Wind roared down from the mountains with a sound that shook the earth itself. Snow did not drift gently. It slammed against walls and roofs in hard sheets. The curved roof of her Quonset hut caught the blast and sent it sliding upward. The structure shuddered, ribs creaking, but it did not bow. Inside, she fed the stove with care. Dry firewood caught quickly, flames steady and bright. The warmth built slow and sure. She listened to the wind batter the north wall and felt the hut answer with strength. Then through the storm she heard it. A crack, not from her hut, from the trees. Another crack followed, louder this time, wood giving way under pressure. She stepped to the door and opened it a narrow slit. Snow rushed in at once, biting her face. Through the white chaos she could barely see the outline of the pine trees, but she saw enough. The crooked frame they had built bent under the weight of wet snow. One rib snapped clean, another twisted sideways. A section of their half-formed roof collapsed inward. A shout carried faint through the wind. She closed the door and stood there, heart pounding. They had tried to build a Quonset hut in haste, without patience. Now the storm was tearing it apart. The crack of splitting wood sounded again, followed by the low thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Her first instinct was to stay inside. To protect what she had built, her firewood remained dry. Her stove burned steady, she had prepared. But she also knew that out there, in the dark, men were fighting wind and snow without shelter strong enough to hold. The storm did not care about pride or past grievances. She pulled on her coat and wrapped a scarf tight around her face. Before stepping out, she fed 2 more logs into the stove, making sure the fire would hold while she was gone. Outside, the wind nearly knocked her sideways. Snow blinded her, and each step felt like pushing against a wall. She moved toward the trees by memory more than sight. Shapes loomed ahead, bent low against the storm. One man struggled to lift a fallen rib while another tried to hold down a flapping sheet of scrap tin. The third stood near the ground, bracing against a trunk that threatened to topple. She reached them and grabbed hold of the loose tin before it tore free. Together, without words, they forced it flat against the broken frame. The farmhouse man looked at her through swirling snow. There was no anger in his face now, only fear and frustration. He shouted something about the arch snapping too soon. She shouted back that the wood had not been soaked long enough. They worked like that for several minutes, fighting wind that felt alive and angry. But it became clear the structure would not survive the night. Another rib cracked, and a section folded inward completely. Finally, she grabbed his arm and pointed toward her field. At first he shook his head. She tightened her grip and shouted again. The storm answered with another violent gust. He gave in. One by one, they stumbled across the open field toward her Quonset hut. Snow swirled so thick she could barely see the curved roof ahead. For a moment she feared even her shelter might not stand. But as they reached it, the hut rose steady against the storm, half buried but unbroken. The curved roof sent wind sliding away. Snow piled along the sides instead of crushing the top. She pushed the door open and waved them inside. The sudden warmth felt unreal after the cold. The men stood near the entrance, dripping snow, faces red and stunned. The small space felt tighter with 4 bodies, but the fire burned strong. Dry firewood cracked clean in the stove, giving off steady heat without smoke. No one spoke at first. The farmhouse man looked around at the curved ribs, the sealed seams, the raised stack of wood against the back wall. He looked at the careful mud packed along the edges and the way the roof held firm despite the roar outside. He understood now. Another gust shook the hut hard enough to make the stovepipe rattle. They all froze, eyes lifting to the arch above. The structure groaned but did not break. She moved to the lean-to door and checked the woodpile through a narrow gap. Snow pressed against the boards, but the roof angle had done its work. The firewood remained dry, safe from the storm. The thin boy's father was among the men. He stared at the stove as if memorizing how she fed it, how she kept the draft steady. He asked in a low voice how she had measured the curve. She answered simply, by bending until it felt right, by testing against smaller wains before trusting it against a big one. Outside, something heavy struck the side of the hut. They all jumped. The storm had not reached its peak yet. The farmhouse man stepped closer to the fire. He said he should have fixed the shed when she told him. He said he had thought there would be time. She did not answer that. The wind screamed louder, and snow thudded hard against the north wall. For a moment, it felt as if the entire field might lift and shift. Inside that small Quonset hut built for $7, the four of them stood shoulder to shoulder. The air smelled of pine and iron. The stove glowed bright. But tension did not vanish with warmth. The question still hung between them. When the storm passed, what then? Would the town see this hut as a place of learning? Or would they resent the fact that it had stood while others fell? Another violent crack sounded from the direction of the trees, followed by a distant shout. Someone else was out there? She looked at the farmhouse man. He looked back at her. Without speaking, they both knew the storm was not done claiming what it could. The curved roof above them held firm for now. The firewood remained dry. The stove burned steady against the dark. And outside, in the roaring white night, the final test of winter was still building. The shout outside cut through the storm like a blade. All four of them turned toward the door at once. The wind howled so loud it felt like the mountains themselves were breathing against the hut. Snow slammed into the curved roof, slid off, and piled along the sides in thick drifts. The Quonset hut groaned but held firm, its arch steady against the pressure. "There's someone else out there," the thin boy's father said, already moving toward the door. She did not hesitate this time. She pulled it open and wind rushed in, scattering sparks from the stove. The farmhouse man grabbed a heavy wool blanket from her cot, and together they stepped back into the storm. Visibility was almost gone. Snow whipped sideways, biting at their faces. She could barely see the pine trees, but she heard another cry from that direction. They pushed forward, leaning into the wind. Near the broken frame of the failed shelter, they found the third man from earlier. He had slipped while trying to secure the structure and twisted his ankle. He was not badly hurt, but he could not stand against the wind alone. The storm did not care about pride, and it did not wait for men to find their footing. The farmhouse man and the boy's father lifted him between them. She walked ahead, carving a path through the snow toward her field. Each step felt heavy, but the sight of the curved roof ahead gave her strength. That small $7 shelter stood like a stubborn promise against the white fury. They stumbled inside one by one. She slammed the door shut and dropped the wooden bar across it. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the roar of wind and the steady crackle of dry firewood in the stove. The injured man sank onto the floor near the warmth, breathing hard. She handed him a tin cup of water and checked his ankle. It was swollen but not broken. They wrapped it tight with strips torn from an old shirt. The heat from the stove slowly returned color to their faces. Outside, the storm raged on for hours. Snow buried the lower half of the hut, pressing hard against the north wall. The curved roof shed the weight just as she had planned when she first bent those saplings by the creek. The lean-to creaked under strain, but when she stepped out briefly to check it, she found the firewood still dry, protected by the angle of the roof and the space she had left for air to move. Inside that small Quonset hut, built for $7 and a stubborn heart, 4 grown men sat quietly around the stove. Pride had melted into something else. They were not talking about borrowing or taking anymore. They were watching how the fire burned clean and steady, how the dry pine caught quickly without smoke filling the air. Near midnight, the farmhouse man finally spoke. He said he had thought her foolish when she first marked out that half circle in the snow. He said he believed no woman alone could outlast a winter in that field. His voice was not bitter now. It was low and honest. She told him she had been afraid too. She had not known if the Quonset hut would stand through the first heavy storm. She had not known if her firewood would truly remain dry all winter. She had only known that doing nothing would mean certain failure. So she had worked with what she had. $7, scrap wood, careful hands. The thin boy's father looked around the hut slowly. He said they had rushed their own shelter because they feared being left behind. They had not taken the time to bend the wood right or seal the seams. Winter punished haste. The words settled deep. Toward morning, the storm began to weaken. The wind dropped first, Then the snowfall slowed from a roar to a steady drift. When the first gray light filtered through the narrow window slit, they opened the door together. The world outside had changed. Snow lay piled high against the sides of the hut, but the curved roof had done its work. The Quonset hut stood strong, only half buried but unbroken. Beyond the field, the broken frame among the pines lay collapsed completely, a tangle of ribs and scrap tin. In town, chimneys smoked thin. Some roofs had sagged under the weight. The farmhouse shed had finally given way during the night, its roof caved in for good. They stepped out into the cold morning and looked at what remained. No one spoke of taking her firewood now. Instead, the farmhouse man cleared his throat and asked if she would show them how to build the arch properly once the snow settled. He said he would pay for lumber this time. He said he would soak the saplings like she had told him. He said he would listen. The thin boy ran across the field a little later, eyes wide as he took in the sight of her hut standing firm while others had failed. He hugged his father without shame. Word traveled quickly through town that day. The woman thrown out before winter had not only survived the blizzard, but she had sheltered others when their own structure collapsed. The story shifted. No longer about pride or selfishness, it became about preparation, about building smart instead of building fast. Over the next week, as roads were cleared and roofs repaired, more people walked out to her field. Some came quiet and respectful, some came with open questions. They studied the curve of her Quonset hut, the way the ribs were spaced, the way the seams were sealed with mud and straw. They examined the lean-to and how the firewood remained dry beneath its angled roof. She showed them everything. She explained why airspace mattered between logs, why stacking bark side up helped shed moisture, why lifting wood off frozen ground prevented rot. She told them that $7 had bought her tools, but patience had built the shelter. The farmhouse man offered to help reinforce her hut in spring, to add a stronger door and better stovepipe. He also offered her paid work repairing fences once the thaw came, not as charity, as respect. The thin boy's father began building his own Quonset hut properly this time, soaking saplings in the creek, bending them slow. She walked over more than once to check the curve, to make sure it did not strain too tight. There was no resentment now, only shared focus. As winter stretched on, her firewood continued to burn clean and steady. She rationed carefully but no longer guarded it in fear. When another family stack ran low in late February, they came to ask, not to take. She sold a few logs at a fair price and helped them build a better rack for next year. The town began to change in small ways. Woodpiles rose higher off the ground. Lean-tos angled sharper against the wind. Curved roofs appeared here and there, not perfect but learning. The phrase, "keep it dry all winter," became something of a saying, repeated whenever someone spoke of preparing early. By the time the first signs of spring touched the field, the snow around her hut had shrunk back, revealing the full shape of the arch once more. What had started as a lonely shelter now stood as a symbol of hard lessons learned. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the mountains gold, she stood outside her Quonset hut and looked toward the farmhouse. The man who had once shut the door on her now walked across the field without hesitation. He carried a small bundle under his arm. He stopped a few feet away and handed it to her. Inside was a new hammer and a small pouch of nails. He said it was payment for the knowledge she had shared. He said winter had taught him more than he expected. She took the gift and nodded. There was no need for long speeches. The curved roof above her had already spoken louder than words. It had proven that being thrown out before winter did not mean being defeated. It had shown that with $7, careful hands, and stubborn will, a person could build something strong enough to stand against both storm and doubt. When the thaw finally came, water ran bright through the creek where she had once soaked saplings. The field softened, birds returned. The Quonset hut remained standing, weathered but proud. She no longer felt like someone cast aside. She felt like someone who had built her place. And as smoke rose steady from her stovepipe one last cold evening before true spring, she knew the story people would tell was no longer about being thrown out. It was about survival, preparation, and the power of doing things right the first time. Her firewood had remained dry all winter. So had her resolve.